tonight is really a discussion between two colleagues and collaborators. And although the book is kind of the centerpiece for the discussion, what I'm hoping is that we can really spend most of the time in a discussion between Shawn and I, and hopefully it will work out that way. So I'm going to give a brief 10 to 12 minute kind of introduction to the topic, and then I'll hand it over to my dear colleague, Shawn Rickenbacker. Throughout history, territory has been occupied and inherently entangled with the various modes of power and colonization. As empires fabricated walls and stretched their power forcefully outside their own boundaries in order to exert control, territory has been manipulated over and over again. And it is argued in this project that such processes of territorial occupation describe planetary scales of enclosing nature, both politically and economically. From Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace to Buckminster Fuller's Spaceship Earth, nature became enclosed. Fuller's geodesic domes became symbols of American counterculture, yet in his description of Spaceship Earth, the environment inside the dome seems to have priority over everything residing outside. A world of civilized control on its interior and wilderness, war, and wasteland on the outside. Particularly in the post-war era, humanity became obsessed with generating a fully closed and synthetically constructed world in a machine. As we identify contemporary challenges faced in a post-COVID world, perhaps problems with the design praxis and ideological incompetence are failing to produce innovative environmental strategies or to raise questions regarding air, atmosphere, and the capital of the vertically enclosed. From instances of climate-controlled air systems in single-family residences to an increase of international investments in the construction of pencil towers made available through air rights, the built environment encompasses and encloses volumes of space for the sake of capital and political control. About a year and a half ago, I was approached by Urban Next to develop the first podcast series that they would continue to build upon. And they asked if I had any material to share to begin this podcast series. And I said, I have an idea, but it relies on a whole group of scholars that come from a diverse field. And this includes scholars as your own colleague and Professor Shawn Rickenbacker, but it also includes folks from the history of science and technology, landscape architecture. It comes from other folks in other fields that range all the way to feminist studies and indigenous studies, really regarding this question about enclosure.
Welcome to Urban Next Exchanges, a podcast by urbannext.net, the digital platform that aims to expand architecture to rethink cities. You are listening to an episode from Nature of Enclosure, a series hosted by Jeffrey S. Nesbit, exploring the status of enclosure in the design fields and its impact on contemporary forms of capital, culture, and politics.
So it began as a series of conversations, and what quickly became apparent is that it might be relevant to also kind of archive these conversations through a series of essays, which I've now edited, and the book will be out. Unfortunately, it's not out yet, but it will be in press hopefully in the next month or two. So for purposes of the book, the architecture of object and infrastructure as utility are not of primary concern. Instead, we consider the relationship between economics and forms of power to include cultural imagination and the role of architecture in creating closed forms of capital as a condition of infrastructure. As Hannah Arendt tells us, it is in the nature of being to appear and thus disclose itself. It is in the nature of process to remain invisible. And thus the objects of enclosures as such appear to be incubators for perhaps something else entirely. So the book is organized in 3 parts. The first part being the nature of the synthetic environment, the second part, air, capital, and the planetary imaginary, and the third, enclosed boundaries of political geographies. And this book, as I mentioned, continues the conversations with these essays, really reflecting on the provocations from the discussions in an attempt to expand the discourse of enclosed environments to our related and allied design fields. Antoine Picon writes a provocative foreword to kind of kick off the book. So part 1, the nature of the synthetic environment. In this first section, the essays establish primary definitions and historical episodes that describe nature as a synthetic construction of enclosed space, environment, and technology.
Recently, the insight has become construction of worlds with such hubris and such possibility of reproducing climatic regimes, activities from other biomes copied and pasted, that I think that this is something extraordinarily eerie that has transgressed the dichotomy of inside outside. So it's not just about controlling and crafting a climate inside. If you think of projects like huge centers in China that create oceans inside and provide the opportunity of instant gratification.
So the section opens with Lydia Calipoletti, who you were just hearing, on the chapter Bubble Problems, an Archaeology of Infection and Environmental Control, which outlines the historical and contemporary society, culture, and structure of closed worlds. From the sterilization methods and space-related activities in NASA's laboratories to the rise of environmental consciousness, Calipoletti provides a useful framework for questions of outside and inside what she calls hysteria. Adjacent to these sealed simulations and space cabin simulators, intentionally the other chapters such as In Praise of the Open by Alexandra Jeske explores a different type of synthetic nature through the interior ecology of the greenhouse. She poetically describes the deeper relationships between loneliness and closure and the banyan under glass, a kind of garden in the machine. It was the traditional European garden, an exterior curation of natural vegetation that was used to demonstrate wealth, intelligence, and power. However, by the 20th century, the former notion of garden was transformed entirely into a technologically occupied space. Moving from these massive cosmos back down towards questions of computation and biological systems, in her chapter, Computing Unbounded, De-anthropocizing Knowledge in Living Systems, Rachel Armstrong describes the more than human realm of our biological world. For Armstrong, the importance of computational systems contributes to the evolutionary diversity of future ecologies. Part 2, Air, Capital, and the Planetary Imaginary, expands on the role of air in politics and shaping new architecturally kinetic environments from interior air to the vertically occupied. This section describes air as a form of knowledge, of design knowledge, rendering the planetary atmosphere as a legible and controlled economic state, and challenges future ways of living on the ground and in the air.
Thanks so much for having me. And it's been wonderful to listen and read these texts by Daisy and Daniel, which really bring to light our current insufficiencies at seeing and representing the full presence and functions of enclosures, particularly with respect to air. And I found myself in thinking about these writing and the work, asking myself 3 rather innocent questions. And the first being, maybe because of the enormity of negative impacts that, Daisy describes in red lighting practices today, and After Comfort by David, I began questioning whether the enclosure by nature was inherently good or bad. Not so much to make a blanket judgment and call it quits and condemn the very act of building and architecture. There doesn't seem to be an argument that in order to survive, we need to enclose. But in thinking about both good and bad enclosures, to hopefully engage with a more productive, expansive framework for thinking about the enclosure as incredibly dynamic, multi-layered, and exponentially large space. It's not a flattened sort of boundary.
That was Mei-Ling Loco in her work on what she calls the colonization of air. And Mei-Ling shows how the reproduction of air in the greenhouse and the rejection of air in buildings are forms of the colonial project and equally contribute to the failures of sensible climate strategies around the world. The next chapter by Daniel Barber focuses on the interior air as a politics of opening. Barber claims that the invention and ubiquitous use of air conditioning systems around the world, along with high-rise towers of capital and the sprawling urban footprint, gave rise to an unhealthy and accelerated challenge in global climate management. The section concludes with preliminary notes on the late capitalist skyscraper as a morphology of enclosure by Mariano Gomez Luque, theorizing the very tall building from the 20th century as a vehicle for global trade, economy, and capital accumulation. For Gomez Luque, the environmental crisis could be traced by the morphology of enclosure, including late capitalism's ability to racialize and exploit the semi-privatization of public space on the ground and in the sky. Part 3, the enclosed boundaries of political geographies.
Economic order, I guess, which is of interest to me, in how the kind of geopolitics play out and this ever-changing disposition of planetary urbanism, the kind of accelerated transition from one mode to the next as it expands across these territories, the terraforming that is described. I'm curious to know if, in fact, the partitioning and commodification of territories provides us any opportunity to kind of examine how those territories and the commodification is abstracted into these forms, these morphologies of, and again, to use Mariano's description, the abstraction of what might be even financial pro forma in relationship to exploiting the kind of limited resources of land that in many cases presents the need for capitalist accumulation and further speculation, right?
So obviously hearing from ours truly, Shawn Rickenbacker. With Shawn, beginning with Through the Looking Glass, Shawn argues that the enclosures of buildings bounding public space contributes to the contemporary challenges of American society and politics. For Rickenbacker, the facade, including screens, advertisements, and the commercial aesthetic, became a symbol of corporate messaging to signal and stratify the public realm, associated with surveillance, land ownership, and certainly control. And obviously we'll learn more from Shawn here momentarily. But this kind of enclosure also moves outward horizontally across the planet to critically illustrate how public space, land, and vast territories reveal deep cultural and political forms for how geographic space has become hostile, militarized, and controlled. Moving more specifically into questions of land enclosure, Julius Machelow's chapter, Ecological Accounting and the Spatial Dynamic of Incentivized Conservation, Julia uses forest harvesting practices in Southern Ontario to better understand financial investments invisible labor practices, management life cycles, and ecological impacts shaping broader practices of land governance. Josh Nason extends the conversation into conservation practices tied to the rise of enclosure of wilderness as a form of nation building in his chapter, Rebound, Dialogues Around National Parks. And lastly, the book concludes with the deeply personal reflection from Mishuana Guoman. In her chapter, Flooding Settler Enclosures, Asserting Indigenous Presence, Guoman reflects on how the relationship between geography, land, mapping, and language contributes to narration and sovereignty. And thus, racialized spaces and nation-state practices portrayed by Guoman destroy the presence of indigeneity, aesthetics, and the embodied sovereignty of land, water, air, and life.
I am been recently traveling throughout my home territories on Tonawanda Band of Seneca, and I traveled from there to Maine. So this kind of discussion about what is the nature of enclosure for me also includes questions about what does presence mean to me? What does it mean to be present in one's own territory? That kind of defies a nature of enclosure that's been implemented through colonial structures. So I was traveling to my homelands, Haudenosaunee territory, and what you might recognize as upper state New York after quarantining in Maine, a place I grew up close to the Penobscot and Passamaquoddy people of the Don.
So such processes in this project reveal political and geographic boundaries, from the small interiors to the city-urban footprints out to the vast geographies of land governance. And these, by showing how these environments are marked, militarized, and eventually made inaccessible, invisible, and certainly enclosed. Processes of urbanization are increasingly extended into a wide variety of geographic conditions across the globe. Regardless of its defined parameters, the definitions of enclosed forms of capital have been critically redefined to loosen the framework of such specificities of land, air, and bounded rationality. I thank you for listening, and I will now turn it over to Shawn.
Great, Jeffrey. Thank you so much. And let me go ahead and start and share my screen. Excuse me. Minor technical difficulty, just once should be working.
There we go.
Are you seeing?
Not yet. You might want to try it again.
There we go.
There it is.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you again. Thank you, Marta. Thank you, Jeffrey. And thank you for those who are in attendance. I just want to start out by acknowledging the work that Jeffrey has been able to assemble in this publication. It's been extraordinary to participate both in the podcast and in the production of the publication. And it's allowed me to, under Jeffrey's prompt on the nature of enclosure, tackle some issues that were very prescient and at the time that he was asking for contributions to this subject. And so, you know, in part, my colleagues at City College and being here in New York and watching a series of events unfold in relationship to the Black Lives Matter movement, the quest for social justice and spatial justice and equity, things very close to the mission of the JMAX Bond Center. We were really watching the city and cities across this country sort of unfold and enter into a different kind of territory whereby protests and the right to debate political as well as economic realities was being played out in what one would imagine would be called public space. And I wasn't so sure about this, and really had conversations with Jeffrey and others about how is the way that the city is changing in relationship to these events, giving us further, if any, further information as to the evolution and or perhaps the history of how public space, and in some regards, the enclosure of that public space or the types of material that affront that public space might be suggestive of other ways for us to read the city, as well as the nature of enclosure, meaning the buildings that front those public spaces. So what I'd love to do, one is remark on a number of things that I thought were instrumental in this book, particularly in Jeffrey's introduction, that upon rereading allowed me to further identify that we were really speaking a very similar language. I think all of the authors here were looking at this from very different vantage points, but the underlying connections that Jeffrey has articulated in the introduction are pretty profound. And so I'll just try to touch on a couple of those as I proceed through these images, and which gives you a little bit of background about my contribution to this, which I won't read the entire thing. I'm hopeful that you all, when the book is ready, will get a copy, and I know we'll have a couple of copies in school, and then you'll be able to read the text at length. But to start, hopefully you all recognize this to some degree. This is, close that. This is the famed and heralded Saks Fifth Avenue in New York City. And I know we have a number of international students. I have a few in my own unit who may not be familiar with this building, but it is an iconic building with respect to commerce, public space, spectacle, and so much more that I really took an opportunity to kind of understand and utilize to address this issue of what is public and what is the nature of enclosure that affronts this public space. So my work really begins with not so much the building, but the very specific zone of the building at the street level. And many of us understand this to be the storefront. Many have referred to it as the display window. Very important, one could even say invention, American invention with regards to American commerce, stemming from the department store, the late 1800s, particularly gaining momentum in terms of its power in the 1920s and 30s. And I make an argument in the paper that going into the 1950s with the advent of advertising as a career discipline, had really utilized these mechanisms, these pieces of architecture at the base of commercial buildings, particularly retail establishments, as a highly performing aspect of their advertising and marketing. Everything from automobiles to well-designed products. And then later on, we will start to see an increased sophistication of what was being displayed in these windows. Really the device of corporations, businesses, and business models being factored around these elements of architecture, elements of public space, elements of enclosure by which the larger buildings above, in many instances at street level, were certainly less noticeable or less of interest for the typical person and pedestrian on the street. Again, these are images from the 1930s. Again, Saks Fifth Avenue. If you notice the image on the right, the background there, this is through that display glass window, but the background there shows what might be the evolution of the modern home interior, complete with the recently designed and contracted by Knoll, the Barcelona chairs by Mies van der Rohe, shown along with a well-dressed patron that is associating themselves in their lifestyle with this kind of material and product. So even today, we still see similarities and the residual of this material, the looking glass is what I call it, for the obvious reason that you see here. A picture from the Library of Congress showing what is most easily recognized is the holiday celebratory designs that would normally take place in a lot of these display windows, especially for the larger department stores that were known to draw tremendous crowds. And here, as recent as 2020, this is the Cartier display here in New York City during the pandemic, by which this article goes on to suggest that there was a prompt in the way that jewelers had to rethink how they would traditionally display their wares in these kind of lavish, elaborate designs behind the glass, in some ways trying to acknowledge the difficult times that we were all living. Whether they succeed or not is hard to tell, but we will sort of think about this as I come towards the kind of thesis that I'm trying to build here. The New York Times also reported a number of times on department stores and the vehicles by which they would use to advertise and market. And in many instances, we'll find that the spectacle of the display window started to introduce everything from art to even political statements. And so the evolution of this territory, this enclosure, is certainly doing a double duty. It has a dual purpose of not being sort of agnostic with respect to commercialism and consumerism, but in fact is a key instrument in that. So speaking of artists here, well before some of their success in the case of Andy Warhol on the right, at the Bonwit Teller display in 1961, a former retailer also located on Fifth Avenue. And then Salvador Dali in 1939 was actually contracted by the department store to design these displays in their display windows. And in many instances, the artists were attempting to provide commentary on society and or consumerism. So Salvador Dali has the gaze, the kind of partial figures of a female's legs there, the crossing, there's many ideas about how one could interpret the messaging here, but certainly there was commentary, as was the comic strips behind Andy Warhol's work here shown. And many argue that this was in fact key time in Andy Warhol's life in terms of him being propelled to the fame and success that he went on to have. Now, I'm going to start to kind of elaborate on the nature of what was behind the glass and how that space was being used by these companies and corporations, and the kind of semi-public space that fronts them, and how through today we see that space being played out and politicized through these various movements that we've most recently lived through. This is an image of Bertolf Goodman's casino-themed window here, another department store here in New York City. The point here being that the disposable income or the assumptions of a certain lifestyle, the regalia and the imagery that goes along with that were really part and parcel to the way that these display windows were utilized to communicate to society. And so getting back to Saks Fifth Avenue as a kind of case study, if you will, the importance of recognizing the difference between the public realm, the lower realm of the building, and the upper floors. Those upper floors not in any similar way communicating in the way that the lower levels do in this capacity. So a close-up view of that, the likes of such purveyors as Gucci, Christian Dior, some of these names hopefully are familiar, whether you own them or at least just are aware of them. But this is some of the highest levels of luxury, utilizing these spaces and truly communicating to what I would say is a segment of the population, perhaps not the general population, which has everything built into it from aspirations, goals, desires, et cetera, playing on the kind of human experience in this public realm. Again, more of the same of that in the form of not only just selling wares, but selling experiences, lifestyle, and communicating kind of social ideals. So just very quickly, the trajectory of the storefront becomes a bit more complicated in the 70s, 80s, and 90s even, whereby the internet shopping, and the likes of high-end retail and even mid-level retail decide that, well, we could actually transition from the storefront and the display window to the standalone flagship or the outpost, if you will, an actual store that begins to then have within it its own display. But now the store, the physical outpost or flagship is also now partaking in this role by which it is again communicating as a form of advertising and or marketing. And then perhaps a second or third generation of this evolution is the standalone structure whereby the window has now ballooned to the actual material of architecture, in this case, of Christian Dior on the right. And if you are paying attention here, this is, I should have this label, but this is Gucci on the right at the base of the Trump Tower, again on Fifth Avenue. This is architecture sort of in between, the in between of architecture, public space, and advertising. This is kind of an adaptive reuse grafting, if you will, of the Louis Vuitton store, really transforming the lower levels, the level of value, right? The interface between the public in this sector of the economy and the way that global enterprise works is more valuable than the upper floors, obviously. And so we see these transformations happening here. Now, clearly there's a kind of one singular objective when presented with the images that I've just shown you, but clearly the power of these spaces to communicate well beyond consumerism is pretty well documented as well, but also doesn't appear as often. So to some extent, you have fantasy on the left, the kind of sequenced gown, the stallion, the true sort of image of fantasy with the counter messaging of the importance of voting, right? And this again, these are the range of store displays, again at Saks Fifth Avenue. Now, if I fast forward a bit, we now enter into a very recent time, 2019 through 2020 and 2021, where we saw a rapid and startling transformation of not only window displays, but really the lower territory of major cities, particularly the downtown shopping areas, central business districts, went through this, what you're seeing here, this very quick transformation of being plywood secured to protect these establishments and their forlorn investments and interests from what they imagined to be an unruly, disgruntled public that now was associating these very establishments with forms of oppression, forms of exploitation that had exacerbated and led to inequality, and in some instances, the death of individuals. So George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others. And so the language here is very, very deliberate, certainly not with respect to an attempt to sell anything, but an attempt to communicate in this regard outright frustration. Here on the right is the Coach store in New York. And if you look carefully at the figure drawn almost as a sort of, I'm forgetting the name of the character there that often brings death, but the text reads "No Coach," which is in opposition to the name of the store, the name of the establishment, the company that looks to then again profit from the idea of using these spaces to communicate what they have to sell. Now, the destruction of public space, the destruction of private property that would be in tandem with that public space has a very long history. This is not new to America, but a very sort of abstract, but yet very real and powerful event that happened in 1921 was that a town in Oklahoma, Tulsa, Oklahoma, known as Greenwood, was also affectionately known as Black Wall Street. And this area and city or community just outside of Tulsa was extremely well known and heralded for the success of this community to have its own functioning business community, residential community. And if you are able to read some of the text there, there were something along the lines of 159 businesses in a directory attributed to Greenwood. 120 of those businesses also showed up in the city directory, 1,126 residences. The list can go on to the number of attributes that suggested that this was a strong and highly functioning community with a very strong and dominating cultural and consumer corridor that serviced that community. Based on the accusations of a sexual assault, a very angry white mob essentially burned this entire community down to the ground and very much so targeted their commercial corridor, knowing that it was the livelihood of that community. There's a number of publications on this for those who are interested. Again, it's becoming more known as a part of American history that we are beginning to uncover and unpack. Here are some images of the Black Wall Street of Greenwood, which is a community of Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Tulsa Race Massacre, it's the name of it. The vast destruction of human life and property shown here on the right. This is the same road. This all took place in about 48 hours. For those who might be interested, the story is still under production, in fact, by the likes of NBA All-Stars, Russell Westbrook and LeBron James, working with the History Channel and CNN to tell the story of this community. But again, my point here is that this country has a history of attacking, if you will, as a form of protest, the commercial corridor, the livelihood of capitalism, if you will, in an attempt to disrupt and communicate heartfelt and really deep-seated frustrations and intentions. So during the the Black Lives Matter movement, and also during the re-election, which kind of flowed after that event, the likes of some very, very contemporary establishments. This is the Puma headquarters here on Fifth Avenue, Dior, as we've seen earlier, some stores here at the bottom right, J. Crew here in New York City, attempting to align itself with the protests in the hopes that that kind of destruction and mayhem would not take place at their establishment. And again, if you read the sign here held up in the artist rendition, it says, freedom isn't free, which is an interesting kind of thought when you think about the expense that we incur when we engage in consumer practices. The powerful imagery for me really came to a full head as I tried to write about this in this publication, was seeing on my way home from City College to Brooklyn, I happened to drive down Fifth Avenue. This is a photograph that I actually had taken in my route home. And so much so, I was so taken by this image that, again, in conversations with Jeffrey and other authors of this publication, tried to amass an understanding of how we can reread public space, how we can reread the nature of enclosure of our cities and the buildings that front these public spaces, and understand how they participate in both, not just the consumer process, but the political process, the protesting process, the civic process, which is then reappointed by those same entities, or at least protected and presented back to us in a very, very different form in terms of the protection, the security, and even the militarization of those spaces, suggesting that they are, in fact, perhaps more private than they are public, which is shown in this view. Here is private security forces that Mike Davis had spoken about in his publication years prior, protecting Saks Fifth Avenue, complete with guard dogs. And if you were to look closely, there's some chain link fence and even barbed wire there. I think I'm on my last image, and then we can engage in a conversation about a little bit more of this. So the private security forces, the interesting thing here, and I'll wrap up and hopefully we can enter into a longer conversation. Here they're shown on the left as a close-up guarding that same space that worked so hard over its existence and even evolution into standalone architecture, and some spectacular architecture at that. But the contradictory aspects of whether or not these spaces and how they interact with the public are truly part of the public domain, or are they foils or apparatus of another type of institution of power and control and capital that really has a tight grip on how we engage these spaces. The image on the right is perhaps quite profound and powerful in that as the gentlemen who are part of a private security detail attempt to do their job, they are also simultaneously showing solidarity in the injustices, the inequities that those same corporations have been known to either support and or participate in, and thus makes you wonder, despite one's role in society, we are all part of this activity, and perhaps it behooves us to be a bit more critical, or as Jeff's publication suggests, examine these territories as we in the design profession are certainly responsible for helping to craft how they become used, how they are designed and utilized in the world. And perhaps it's incumbent upon us to be a bit more critical and understand their ultimate role in how we continue to advance the ideas of public or semi-public or truly privatized space. So I'll end there and hope that Jeff and I could maybe engage in the conversation and also engage you, the audience, in some thoughts here as well.
Thanks so much, Shawn. Incredible. I want to say story, but it's not. It's a condition for which we pass daily, and yet maybe that's one of the most provocative takeaways of your piece, is that we're amongst these suppressive, racial, exclusionary sites on a regular basis, and perhaps we need to read the city like you have done, in new ways, and register the ubiquitous forms that our discipline contributes to on a regular basis, and question the role for which those places are made. I kind of want to hear more from you, Shawn, and certainly from the audience and those attending. But I just want to first say that I think on the last couple images, it makes me wonder, and I'm sort of obsessed with this abstract notion of inside and outside. And it almost makes me wonder, well, maybe we've never really been outside. Maybe there's never been a public, or a public in the sense of commoning of communities and collectives that are in fact free, as you mentioned earlier with one of the graffiti notes, freedom isn't free, but maybe public isn't public. And maybe Shawn, if you want to elaborate on that a bit, I think that would be a great way to start.
Yeah, no, sure. I mean, so I mentioned, and again, a plug for a really profound and provocative introduction to the nature of enclosure. Jeff, in your introduction, you have a passage here that refers to Edward Soldier's work, where he identifies 3 drivers for what he calls regional urbanism. And this is within the postmodern metropolis. And they are the globalization of capital. So as I read these spaces, particularly storefronts and display window, I see that globalization activity, right? And particularly the capital responsible for that. The opulence of the chosen materials, the address of the buildings, et cetera. The second is the creation of a new economy. The very purpose of the display window is to drive desire, right? And that driving of desire is the creation of new economies, new capital opportunities where capital is exchanged. And then lastly, the effects from the revolution of technologies. And so at some point, which I don't elaborate on too much, but I think we've all heard the stories of personal surveillance entering into a establishment, particularly people of color are very familiar with this. But then technology transitioned, and CCTV and cameras and other devices stepped in and removed a certain sort of blockade or barrier, and it made these spaces appear to be even more accessible. But again, the communication here is that the effects of the revolution in technology allowed for what appeared to be an opening up. But if anything, we know that surveillance is the replacement. And so this is perception again. It appears to be open, it appears to be public. I think the best example of that would be the Zacuti Park in Lower Manhattan, that upon the Occupy movement and Occupy Wall Street, to everyone's dismay and surprise, they were informed that that is not a public space. In fact, it's a private space. And so again, the very careful scripting that these powerful corporations, and this is the power of globalization, to rewrite the script as we know it, or as we might expect it. So the appearance of public it's a very gray area. And so I think it's a great opportunity, especially for those in the design professions, to acknowledge this as opposed to suggest some kind of innate understanding, and we move on with our objectives in operation in providing designs for these spaces.
It makes me wonder if we're too far along in the rise of capital accumulation to replace these commercial facades. I mean, I wonder, I mean, almost literally what financial or economic models could produce the capacity to replace the storefront on some extremely expensive real estate.
Well, yeah, I mean, so what if we had more time, we could certainly get into this, but so very perhaps well-known and not so well-known fact is that a number of these commercial establishments, particularly the model by which the storefront is turned into a standalone or flagship store, in many cities throughout the world, those stores do not make a profit. The company writes off the loss as advertising and marketing. So that Christian Dior store can never sell enough goods from that one store to pay overhead and rent. It's truly only there as advertising. And so I don't think we'll ever be at a point where we're replacing this storefront. I think what's at stake here is what these spaces, what Through the Looking Glass presents to you. And is there opportunity by which the conversation around, as in the Andy Warhol or Salvador Dali work, can the storefront and or the display window engage in this very conversation? What is the nature of the public space that you're looking from? And what are you looking into? What do we, these corporations, have to offer back to you besides our wares and our things that we'd like to sell to you, as one provocation?
I just want to share something really fast.
Okay, I'll have a question from the floor. Questions.
Okay, okay.
I just real quick, your point about the storefront is a loss. It reminds me of the Prada store in Marfa, which is a storefront, in the wilderness, and still it's like one of the best billboards, most effective billboards, because still today people go by and take a picture in front of this thing on a regular basis, and there's no customers, there's no tellers, there's nobody working in the shop, the doors don't open, and the whole store is literally a display, and just a reminder for all of us as we talk about the
Absolutely. So very similar, especially with the lovely horse and the pastoral setting in the background. Yeah. So I guess there's some questions.
Yeah, take the floor, and then I see we got some in the chat, but please say your name and just go ahead, they'll hear you.
Hi.
You don't have to talk right in,
Hi. I guess I have a comment and a question. I guess like when you were showing the pictures and the slides, I don't know why I thought of like Las Meninas, the Velázquez painting. And I thought of this like idea of being seen, but also like not being seen. I guess my question is like, if we were to like break down these like enclosures and revert them to like a state of like a deeper like porosity or something like that, like what do we do with the objects that are just like sitting in there, like this material capital that's just sitting in the store? If it doesn't speak to like the class that's ripping down like the enclosure, then what do we do with that waste?
Yeah, well, I mean, to address the first part of your question, I think you touched on what society might have been demanding in the form of those marches is to be seen and for inequity to be recognized and dealt with. as opposed to a ever increasing assault on our senses to engage in consumer practices. So interestingly enough, the mirror that many artists have used in storefront window displays to reflect back the viewer's gaze is a really powerful instrument. Right? You see yourself, and you see yourself in the context of that city behind you. Right? You're an active participant. So I simply think, I'm not advocating for the destruction or removal of the display window or storefronts. What I think is actually most critical here is, if those storefronts are to be used for messaging, can we democratize the messaging? Right? Is there a way by which, even the proceeds from sales of goods could go to, as you saw, voting and information campaigns, just everyday life. I think we had several speakers speak to the value of everyday life that is simply not taken into consideration. And if that can be part and parcel of our experiences, I think we would all be better for it.
Just to add a quick comment here on store windows being used for progressive as opposed for extractive purposes. The store window was hugely important in the campaign for women's suffrage, because the women were so many involved in, were consumers. And so displays were mounted in department stores to promote the suffrage cause in the early part of the 20th century. There's a wonderful essay by Jessica Sewell about that, looking at the technology of window displays and the ways in which they were taken advantage of in order to advance the vote. I was quite taken with that photo that you showed. The comparisons, several of your comparisons, Shawn, were really quite stunning. But anyway, enough from me. Let's hear from some other people. Marvin, you have a question? Do you want to read it?
Sure. Thank you, Professor Gutman.
Sure.
Thank you so much for creating a space for this really interesting and also just important discussion. So my question is, as the United States becomes more complex, and I guess the image of the security officers that you showed just made me sort of think more about, at least here in New York, how during the process, how policing is, or maybe that conversation is changing. So I guess I'm just curious, around race and who holds power. Do you think that's going to shift? So for example, like now we have a Black mayor who was part of the NYPD. How does that complicate all of this and these discussions, or this discussion around public and private space? Should we be sort of hopeful that we're turning a corner, or should we be cynical because we had a Black president, and and for all intents and purposes, he was kind of really blocked by a portion of Congress. So I'm just curious how you sort of see all of this sort of transpiring.
Sure.
And if you could predict.
I can predict. That's a tough one. But I'll take the first part of the question for sure. I mean, I'm eternally optimistic. I mean, I think the movement itself was a barometer whereby the silence was no longer acceptable. And you had to hear those voices. And I think we have seen, particularly the power structure of capital, at least listen and acknowledge that there's a groundswell that is informed and empowered and understands a lot about how these systems of control have been operating and with impunity, and how that would have to stop and change. So one of the slides, excuse the expletive, but F the police, it's very clear that there are tensions that still reside. And so I've been privy to some conversations where there's an expectation that we can no longer do business as usual. I think that's a great opportunity for this question of how public space is, how the equity in relationship to the use of public space is distributed. And so is it only about consumerism and retail, or is there space for the everyday? Is there space for the diversity of occupants within the city communicating? So I'm aware that there's a number of stores who have been working with artists from various backgrounds and diversities, by which they are encouraging them and want them to use, similar to what you saw with Salvador Dali and Andy Warhol, use those display windows again as a means to convey their social messaging that they see in their art. So even that in and of itself, I think, is a transformation that I welcome. And I think similarly, the way that architects, landscape architects and designers begin to think about the use of this very particular zone of the city, particularly in urban environments, how that not simply the kind of democratic notion of transparency, which we've heard that argument over and over again. To me, I realize it's not so much the transparency that matters, it's what's being displayed behind or beyond the transparency, through the looking glass. What are you giving back to society in this highly coveted, highly useful space? It should be democratized in that way for those, and reflect the diversity of the cities that they're occupying. So I hope that answered the first. I can't really predict, given the new leadership, but I can tell you that the Bond Center is adamant about interfacing directly with political leadership. Right? So some of the ideas that we work on are not simply to be contained within the canon of the institution, but they're really meant to change policy and awaken leadership to observations that you and I and our students and colleagues are making, that we think are valuable information for those who are writing the laws for our cities.
Thank you very much, Professor Rickenbacker.
So Professor Zhang, you have a question, a wonderful one. Are you still here, Zihao? There you are. Great.
I'm here.
Hey,
Do you want me to elaborate on my question?
Yeah, read it
Sure.
and elaborate. Then let's have a discussion.
Yeah.
Maybe we can talk a bit about commenting, right?
Sure. Because again, thanks for the presentation. I just learned a lot. And one thing, this thing I've been sort of bothering me, for a long time, is this kind of category of between public and private. We deploy this lens to sort of evaluate and sort of to understand space, but somehow, I think, in my opinion, I think, public and private is such a, arbitrary categories that is deeply embedded in this kind of individualism that, is really this kind of, really individualism. We want to draw a arbitrary line in this continuous kind of space in a way. And, especially when you're thinking about, during the COVID, our perception of public and private sort of changed a lot. What is our private boundary around us? Now we draw this new line, 6 feet apart, as a new sort of private bubble around us. So, because I've been sort of asking the same question to different people a lot. Do you have other categories or concepts or useful notions or metaphors even to help us to understand this term, or this kind of a public-private term? Because I've been using, degrees of care, in a way to talk about these issues, and I just wonder if you have other, concepts to talk about, what do we want to sort of say?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting. You present a case for the user, and I guess Jeff might agree with me here. Jeff, weigh in. I know you and I have shared many conversations thinking about public space, not as the definition that is typically used or the kind of graphic that assigns it in a site plan or something, but really understanding it as infrastructure for both militarization, infrastructure for commercial and capital exchange. And those things dominate my view. That's my personal view. And I'm stuck there. And what I do want to do, similar to you, is find out ways to empower the diversity of individuals to reclaim that space. Right now, I simply can't look at it in a way that the term public space wants me to. I honestly don't believe that applies. Not based on what I know and you know, the conversations I've had with friends and colleagues like Jeff, where the way that space has been instrumentalized as a form of infrastructure for the advancement of capital interest is so overwhelmingly obvious to me. I don't know how people walk around and use the term public space, not without sort of qualifying exactly what they're referring to.
Yeah, great question, and thank you all for being here. It's really kind and wonderful questions. I think about it all the time. One of the things, Jihao, that I might posit is that it doesn't matter, first of all, like what we call it, but what it does matter is who and how that area of space is being administered and managed. And that's what matters, I think. And so it's through and often, and some other body of work that I've been developing recently that I refer to as technical lands, it has a lot to do with land use and land use management. And maybe, Jihao, one of the ways we could work through this is start finding new land use laws that would open up the kinds of things that Shawn's really keen on and described so eloquently today. And to me, that is a kind of infrastructure, and I think Shawn and I would probably see eye to eye on that.
A very real public infrastructure,
right?
Which currently public infrastructure has been diminished, almost to what I would imagine is unrecognizable besides parks.
Right. And what's interesting today, speaking of infrastructure, I mean that's sort of some of my interest, is infrastructure is now one of the most political terms you can use with the new, with the new administration's interest to increase infrastructural projects. So, but yeah, great question. I think there was another question.
A few more coming, yeah. So shall Jeffrey Howe, who is joining us from Seattle. Thank you, Jeff, for being here. Let's, can you enter your question into the discussion or your comment? Are you still here?
I think Jeff left.
There's a comment from Annabella.
Is Annabella here? Yes. Okay, Annabella, please.
That picture of the Prada store in Marfa really called my attention, and maybe I misunderstood it, but I interpreted it as a critique of those kind of, if you can call it, like neoliberal forces introducing into a context that clearly isn't like prepared for that in some kind of way. So I was thinking about the reverse situation, that isn't this similar as introducing parks in the city, like the desire of introducing something external into the city, even though it's a necessity. Maybe this photo is that I understood as a critique. Maybe it isn't like we are actually thinking of it. Maybe this is a question that came to my mind.
Yeah, I could see how Jeff's image of the Prada store in Marfa, for me, is evidence of the far-reaching arm of global practices. It will not stop based on the very nature of difference of the environment. That's not what matters. So the idea that a high profile, although the architecture may not be high profile, but it relies on those same mechanisms of the display window. Again, Jeffrey points out there's no staff. The door is locked. You're simply to peer in, and that is meant to promote desires, despite the fact that you are miles away from any major town with services and are expected to be engaging in a natural context. But as the patterns of travel, leisure, and consumerism brings high net worth individuals to those contexts, well, globalization has decided to bring those wares to them. And I think maybe, Annabella, what you are taking exception to is that, should that be happening? Like, should we not be questioning that kind of apparatus that so willfully leaves an environment where perhaps it's more suitable to then create these clashes of contrast that make us pause and think for a moment. So yeah, that, I don't think there's a declaration as to how and why that can happen. But, we have to be on the lookout for those types of things, because those situate the patterns that we have to be aware of and contend with.
So Megan, would you like to ask your question? And I think we'll call this the penultimate question here.
Oh gosh, I hope it's a good one. So my question is, you guys mentioned the sort of potential closing of storefronts and how even online shopping has offered us even a new storefront, which is a digital storefront. And so I'm kind of wondering, as we look at the landscape of storefronts and how much they sort of rent for in New York City, which of course, depending on the neighborhood could vary, but in general, it's a very high rent situation. What happens to the storefront? Like, what happens when we don't want to buy things anymore? The things that these storefronts are selling, and given the rent prices, how do we start to perhaps remarket, rebrand, republicize these spaces as spaces that we actually truly want to sort of interact with, So it's kind of a question on consumerism and the sort of shift from, IRL to digital, and, what's the implications to the sort of public landscape of these storefronts, which I think kind of touches on some stuff that other people are talking about, but curious what your thoughts are.
I would, I'll be very brief, Shawn. It's a fantastic question, Megan. And I sort of wonder if actually most of these shops aren't intended to be profitable to begin with. And so I would be suspect that they're going to linger longer, even though, online shopping dominates the market. But I'll turn to Shawn. That's my sense, and I don't have any evidence of this, but that's sort of my taste of it.
Well, I'm going to go back to Edward Soja's third point, that regional urbanization, and one could think of New York City as regional, similar to Los Angeles, similar to other major cities. The effects from the revolution, or what one could make that plural, revolutions in technology, spur these incremental changes by which the institutions that are governing and utilizing and profiting from these pivot and change. And so in my written piece, I speculate that the display window was simply the precursor to what was then the television. And then the television became the screen, the computer screen, and the computer screen became the phone. And we all know what kind of stream of advertising we receive on our devices. Now, the question is, how does that affect the physical manifestation of these former display windows? Well, that's a great question. And I imagine that some rather brilliant people are sitting in those offices speculating, but I think they have the answer. I think they still know that to simply provide suggestion of desirable lifestyles, things that shine and attract our attention, will then prompt us to simply go home and search them online, and they'll help feed that to us, and we will effectively make a purchase. Remember, this might be a really good place to end, that Xiao was questioning public space. Well, our phones have a history of everywhere we go. And that history gets corroborated and correlated with things that we've searched to purchase. And if you were to search something on Google, it will tell you just how quick or nearby you might be able to acquire it. So I believe the institutions are so crafty with the technology, and they are utilizing the public space as the forum by which to examine our behaviors. And I think we need to just simply be more attuned to examining those very same behaviors and pivot and make suggestions and speculative reactions and responses in kind.
Well said. I also like your point about that the storefront actually is different in the sense that you can see yourself. Pretty powerful, pretty powerful message.
Yeah. And you could potentially even magnify that. And, you know, just watch a young person, a child, see themselves in that size window in a context that they might be visiting. I mean, I think we could all remember back to those days. It's a pretty powerful experience.